Sometimes the heart finds what it needs in the most unexpected places. When we think we have life all figured out, fate has a way of showing us just how wrong we can be. Eleanor Whitmore had everything money could buy in 1887 Colorado, a mansion, fine dresses, and wealthy suitors. But when she vanished from her father's estate, nobody expected to find her 3 days later in the arms of Silas Kane, a rugged mountain man who lived alone in the wilderness. The sight shocked everyone from the church ladies to the saloon keepers. Here was the territory's most refined young woman, curled up peacefully with a wild hermit who hadn't spoken to another soul in years. What happened during those missing days that changed everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Colorado territory like a monument to human ambition. From the wraparound porch of the main house, you could see clear to the Continental Divide, where snow-capped peaks rose like cathedral spires against the endless blue sky. Charles Whitmore had built his empire one railroad tie at a time, and every beam in his mansion told the story of a man who'd clawed his way up from nothing. On this particular September morning in 1887, Eleanor Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, watching the aspen leaves dance in the crisp mountain air. At 23, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their words. Auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, emerald eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. But beauty had become her prison. "Miss Eleanor, your father requests your presence in the library," called Martha, the head housekeeper who'd raised Eleanor since her mother's death 15 years prior. The older woman's voice carried the weight of years spent managing both household and heartbreak. Eleanor sighed, her breath fogging the window pane. She traced a heart in the condensation, then quickly wiped it away. Such childish gestures had no place in the life of Colorado's most eligible heiress. The library smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, a masculine sanctuary where her father conducted the business that kept their world turning. Charles Whitmore sat behind his massive oak desk, his silver pocket watch, a symbol of his devotion to punctuality and profit, gleaming in the morning light. At 58, he remained an imposing figure, his steel-grey beard trimmed with military precision, his dark eyes sharp with intelligence and determination. "Daughter," he said, without looking up from his correspondence, "we need to discuss your future." Eleanor settled into the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap as she'd been taught. "What about my future, father?" "Bartholomew Morrison has asked for your hand in marriage. I've accepted on your behalf." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Morrison, a man whose wealth came from silver mines worked by men who rarely saw their families, whose cold eyes had always made her skin crawl, whose reputation for cruelty toward his workers was whispered about in parlors across Colorado Springs. "Father, surely you can't be serious. Mr. Morrison is one of the wealthiest men in the territory," Charles interrupted, his voice carrying the tone that had cowed railroad executives and politicians alike. "This union will secure our family's position for generations to come." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "But I don't love him." "I barely know him." Charles finally looked up, his expression softening just a fraction. "Love is a luxury, Eleanor. Security is necessity. Your mother understood this when she married me. Mother married you because she chose to. This is different. Your mother married me because her father arranged it, just as I'm arranging this for you. Love came later in its own time." He closed his ledger with finality. "The engagement will be announced at dinner tonight. Morrison will be joining us." Eleanor felt the walls of the library closing in around her. Through the tall windows, she could see the mountains calling to her, vast and wild and free. How many times had she dreamed of walking into those peaks, of breathing air that didn't taste of expectations and obligations? "May I be excused?" she asked quietly. Charles nodded, already returning to his papers. "Martha has prepared your green silk for tonight. It complements your eyes." Eleanor walked through the house she'd called home for 23 years, seeing it now as if for the first time. The imported wallpaper from France, the crystal chandelier that had cost more than most families earned in a decade, the portrait of her mother, beautiful, sad-eyed Catherine Whitmore, who died when Eleanor was just 8 years old. She found herself in the kitchen, where Martha was directing the preparation of what would surely be a feast worthy of an engagement announcement. "Martha," Eleanor said softly, "tell me about the mountain man." The older woman's hands stilled over the bread dough she was kneading. "What mountain man, child? You know which one?" "Silas Kane, the hermit who lives up in the high country." Martha's expression grew troubled. "What's brought this on, Miss Eleanor? Please." "I need to understand," Martha sighed, her weathered hands returning to their work. "Silas Kane was a different man once. Educated, they say, fought in the war, lost everything that mattered to him. Some say his family was killed while he was away fighting. Others claim he did something terrible and can't live with decent folks anymore. How terrible? Nobody knows for certain. He's been up in those mountains for near on 12 years now. Comes to town maybe twice a year for supplies, pays in gold, doesn't speak to anyone unless he has to. Doc Peterson says he's treated Kane a few times for injuries, always pays fair, always polite. But there's a sadness in him that runs deeper than any wound." Eleanor absorbed this information, her mind painting pictures of a man so damaged by life that he'd chosen solitude over society. "Do you think he's dangerous?" Martha studied Eleanor's face carefully. "I think he's a man who wants to be left alone. Why are you asking about such things?" Before Eleanor could answer, her father's voice boomed from the dining room. "Eleanor, our guests are arriving." That evening, seated across from Bartholomew Morrison at her father's dining table, Eleanor felt like a specimen in a display case. Morrison was 42, with thinning brown hair and small, calculating eyes that seemed to catalogue her worth like inventory. His conversation centered entirely on his mining operations and his plans for expanding his holdings. "Of course, once we're married, you'll want to give up any frivolous pursuits," Morrison said, cutting into his beef with surgical precision. "A wife's place is in supporting her husband's endeavors, not pursuing her own fancies." Eleanor had been teaching reading to the children of their ranch hands every Sunday after church. It was the only time she felt truly useful, truly alive. "I enjoy teaching. The children should be learning trades, not wasting time with books they'll never need," Morrison interrupted. "Too much education makes people dissatisfied with their station in life." Charles nodded approvingly. "Bartholomew has very sound ideas about social order." Eleanor excused herself early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely false. In her room, she stood again at her window, looking out at the moonlit peaks that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Somewhere up there, a man lived free from the suffocating weight of society's expectations. Somewhere up there was a life where a person could breathe. She found herself thinking about her mother's journal, hidden away in the bottom drawer of her writing desk. Catherine Whitmore had written in it faithfully until the day she died, pouring out thoughts and feelings she could never express aloud. Eleanor had read every page, searching for clues about the woman who'd given her life. One entry, written just months before her death, had always haunted her. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been braver. If I'd followed my heart instead of my duty. Would I have been happier? Would I have lived longer? I look at my daughter and pray she'll have the courage I never found." Eleanor pulled the journal from its hiding place now, running her fingers over her mother's faded ink. Tomorrow night, she would be formally engaged to a man who saw her as property. In 6 months, she would be his wife. In a year, she might be pregnant with his child. Trapped forever in a life that felt like slow suffocation. The mountains called to her through the window, promising freedom she'd never known and might never know again. But how could a sheltered heiress survive even one night in that wilderness? What did she know about anything beyond drawing rooms and dinner parties? As she prepared for bed, Eleanor's hand brushed against something caught in her dressing table drawer. She pulled out a torn piece of silk ribbon from a dress she'd snagged weeks ago, while walking too close to the rose bushes. The fabric was delicate, expensive, ruined by one moment of carelessness, like her life would be if she didn't act soon. Outside her window, an owl called to its mate, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the longing in her heart. Tomorrow would bring another day of preparation for a future she didn't want. But tonight, for just a few more hours, she could still dream of mountains and freedom and a life lived on her own terms. The silk ribbon lay across her palm like a promise or a warning. Sometimes the most beautiful things were the most fragile. Sometimes they had to break before they could become something stronger. The engagement ring arrived with the morning post, delivered in a velvet-lined box that might as well have been a coffin. Eleanor stared at the massive diamond surrounded by emeralds, beautiful, cold, and worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. It was exactly the sort of ring Bartholomew Morrison would choose. Impressive, expensive, and completely without warmth. "It's magnificent," Martha breathed. Though Eleanor caught the worried glance the older woman shot her way, Eleanor lifted the ring from its silk nest, feeling its weight in her palm. Such a small thing to represent the death of all her dreams. "Yes," she said quietly. Magnificent. That evening, the Whitmore dining room blazed with candlelight and crystal. Charles had invited the town's most prominent families to witness the formal engagement announcement. Eleanor sat like a painted doll in her emerald silk gown, the ring heavy on her finger, smiling until her face ached. Morrison stood and raised his glass, his thin lips curved in what passed for a smile. "Friends, I'm honored to announce my engagement to Miss Eleanor Whitmore. She will make a fine wife and mother, once she's properly guided in her duties." The assembled guests applauded politely. Eleanor caught sight of Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, whose kind eyes held sympathy rather than congratulation. The woman had 6 daughters of her own and understood the weight of expectations placed on young women. "Eleanor," Morrison continued, "perhaps you'd like to say something to our guests." All eyes turned to her. Eleanor rose slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. This was the moment, her last chance to speak her truth before the cage door closed forever. She began, then stopped. Morrison's eyes were cold, waiting for her compliance. Her father's expression warned against any foolishness. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "I'm grateful for Mr. Morrison's proposal," she heard herself say, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. More applause. More congratulations. More chains wrapping around her soul. After the guests departed, Eleanor sat in her room, still wearing the emerald gown, staring at her reflection in the vanity mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, beautiful, privileged, and utterly trapped. The engagement ring caught the lamplight, sending rainbow fragments dancing across the ceiling like tears. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. "Come in." Martha entered carrying a tea tray, her weathered face creased with concern. "Thought you might need something to help you sleep." "I don't think I'll ever sleep again," Eleanor said honestly. Martha set down the tray and moved behind Eleanor's chair, gently removing the pins from her elaborate hairstyle. "Child, I've watched you grow from a wild little girl into a fine young woman. Your mother would be proud of the person you've become. Would she? Or would she be disappointed that I'm making the same mistake she did?" Martha's hands stilled. "What do you mean?" Eleanor turned to face her. "Mother's journal. I've read every word. She married Father because her family arranged it, just like he said. But she was never happy, was she? She was grateful, dutiful, everything a wife should be, but she was never truly happy." The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother found joy where she could. She loved you more than life itself. And she died at 38, worn down by a life she never chose." Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I can't do it, Martha. I can't marry him. I can't spend the rest of my life being grateful for a prison cell, no matter how gilded it might be. Miss Eleanor, you're talking foolishness. Where would you go? What would you do? You've never been outside this valley without an escort." Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the mountains loomed dark against the starlit sky. "I don't know. But I know I can't stay here and slowly die by degrees. Your father would never forgive you. You'd lose everything, your home, your inheritance, your place in society. What good is a place in society if it requires me to stop being myself? Eleanor turned back to Martha, her decision crystallizing with each word. I'd rather be poor and free than rich and caged. Martha sank into the chair by the fireplace, suddenly looking every one of her 60 years. If you're determined to do this foolish thing, at least wait until morning. Plan properly. Take supplies, money. If I wait until morning, I'll lose my courage. Father will see it in my face, and he'll lock me in this room until the wedding. Eleanor moved to her wardrobe, pulling out her most practical dress, a simple brown wool that she'd worn for her secret rides to the far pastures. I have to go now while everyone's asleep. She changed quickly, her hands shaking as she fastened the buttons. The emerald gown lay across the bed like a discarded dream. Eleanor slipped the engagement ring from her finger and placed it on top of the silk fabric. At least take some money, Martha whispered, pulling a small leather pouch from her apron. I've been saving for years. It's not much, but I can't take your savings. You can and you will. Martha pressed the pouch into Eleanor's hands. Your mother would want me to help you find the courage she never had. Eleanor hugged the woman who'd been more of a mother to her than anyone since Catherine's death. Thank you for everything. For raising me, for loving me, for understanding. Where will you go? Eleanor looked toward the window one last time. Into the mountains. As far as I can walk before dawn. Child, that's wilderness out there. Wild animals, storms, men who might hurt me. Like the man Father wants me to marry? Eleanor shouldered a small bag she'd packed with what little she thought might be useful. I'd rather take my chances with wild animals than with a man who sees me as property. Martha caught her arm as she reached for the door. The mountain man you asked about, Silas Kane. His cabin is somewhere up near Eagle's Peak, if you can find him. What? He'll help me? Martha, he's a hermit who hasn't spoken to another soul in years. Why would he help a stranger? Because, Martha said softly, sometimes the people who've been hurt the most are the ones who understand pain in others. And sometimes, child, we have to trust in the kindness of strangers when the people who should love us fail us. Eleanor kissed Martha's cheek one last time, then slipped from her room into the darkened hallway. The house creaked and settled around her as she made her way to the back door, every sound seeming loud as thunder in the midnight quiet. The cool September air hit her face like a benediction as she stepped onto the back porch. Above her, a million stars wheeled across the sky, and somewhere among them were the answers she couldn't find within these walls. She walked toward the mountains without looking back, her feet finding the path by moonlight and instinct. Behind her, the Whitmore estate grew smaller and smaller until it was just another shadow in the valley. Ahead lay the unknown, dangerous, frightening, and absolutely necessary. The first hour was easy, following the well-worn trail that led to the high pastures where their cattle grazed in summer. Eleanor had ridden this path countless times, though never alone and never at night. The familiar landmarks gave her confidence, the lightning-split pine, the creek that sang over smooth stones, the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in spring. But as the trail began to climb more steeply into unfamiliar territory, Eleanor's city-soft shoes began to pinch and blister. Her breath came shorter in the thin mountain air. The cheerful creek became a distant murmur, then faded entirely by the time the eastern sky began to show the first hints of dawn. Eleanor was lost. She stood in a grove of aspen trees, their golden leaves whispering secrets she couldn't understand. Every direction looked the same. Endless forest, stretching up rocky slopes toward peaks that seemed both closer and farther away than when she'd started. Her water was nearly gone. Her feet were bleeding inside her inadequate shoes, and somewhere behind her, the search parties would be forming as soon as her absence was discovered. Eleanor sank down on a fallen log, suddenly understanding the magnitude of what she'd done. She was a sheltered heiress who'd never spent a night outside in her life. And she'd walked into wilderness that could kill her in a dozen different ways. But even as fear crept up her spine, she found she couldn't regret her choice. Better to die free than live as Morrison's property. Better to face whatever dangers the mountains held than submit to a lifetime of slow suffocation in silk and silver. A branch snapped somewhere behind her. Eleanor spun around, her heart hammering, expecting to see her father's men, or worse, Morrison himself, come to drag her back. Instead, she saw nothing but trees and shadows and the growing light of dawn. Another sound, closer this time. Footsteps. Definitely footsteps, moving through the underbrush with the confidence of someone who knew these woods intimately. Eleanor stood frozen, afraid to run and afraid to stay. The footsteps stopped just outside her line of sight, and she held her breath, waiting. "Ma'am," came a voice, deep and careful and surprisingly gentle. "You're a long way from anywhere safe." A man stepped into the clearing, and Eleanor's first thought was that he looked like something from the old stories Martha used to tell. A figure carved from the mountains themselves. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that touched his collar and a beard that couldn't quite hide the strong line of his jaw. His clothes were simple but well-made. Leather vest, worn denim, boots that had seen countless miles of rough country, but it was his eyes that caught her attention, brown as rich earth, and holding a depth of understanding that made her want to tell him everything. "You're Silas Kane," she said. Though she wasn't sure how she knew, he nodded slowly. "And you're the Whitmore girl who's got half the territory searching for her." Eleanor lifted her chin, trying to summon the dignity her father had drilled into her since childhood. "Eleanor Whitmore, yes. And I'm not lost. I'm exactly where I choose to be." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Is that so? And where exactly do you choose to be, Miss Whitmore?" "Free," she said simply. The word hung between them in the morning air, carrying all the weight of everything she'd left behind and everything she hoped to find. Silas Kane studied her for a long moment, taking in her impractical shoes, her torn skirt, the exhaustion and determination warring in her face. "Free is a dangerous place for someone who doesn't know how to survive it," he said finally. "Then teach me," Eleanor heard herself say, surprising them both. "Please." And in that moment, as the sun crested the peaks and painted the world in gold and shadow, Eleanor Whitmore took the first real step toward becoming the woman she was meant to be. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open to unfamiliar surroundings, rough-hewn log walls, a stone fireplace crackling with warmth, and the scent of pine and wood smoke that seemed to have seeped into every corner. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back. Her escape, the long walk through the wilderness, the collapse from exhaustion, and the quiet man who'd carried her unconscious form to safety. She lay on a simple cot, covered with thick wool blankets, still wearing her torn brown dress, but with her ruined shoes placed neatly beside the bed. Across the one-room cabin, Silas Kane sat at a rough wooden table, writing in what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. The morning light streaming through the single window caught the careful movements of his hand as he formed words on the page. "You're awake," he said without looking up, his voice carrying the same gentle tone that had surprised her in the forest. Eleanor struggled to sit up, her body protesting every movement. "How long was I?" "2 days. Silas closed the journal and set down his pencil, a stub of graphite wrapped in paper that looked like it had been sharpened many times. "You were in a bad way when I found you. Dehydrated, exhausted, feet torn up from those fancy shoes." Eleanor looked down at her bandaged feet, shame heating her cheeks. "I'm sorry to be such a burden. I didn't think—" "No, you didn't." The words were blunt but not unkind. City folks never do when they decide to take on the wilderness. The cabin was spartanly furnished, but surprisingly clean and organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with iron pots and pans hanging from hooks nearby. Shelves lined another wall, filled with glass jars containing what looked like preserved foods, dried herbs, and other supplies. A rifle rested in the corner, well-maintained, but clearly used for necessity rather than sport. "Where are we?" Eleanor asked. "My home. About 15 miles northeast of your father's place, near Eagle's Peak." Silas stood and moved to the fireplace, ladling something from a pot into a wooden bowl. "You need to eat." Haven't kept much down in 2 days. He handed her the bowl, a simple stew that smelled better than anything from her father's fancy kitchen. Eleanor took a tentative sip and found it rich with meat and vegetables, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. "This is delicious," she said, surprised by her hunger. "Venison, wild onions, some carrots from my garden." Silas returned to his chair, watching her eat with the careful attention of someone accustomed to tending wounded things. "You asked me to teach you how to be free. First lesson, free people know how to feed themselves." Eleanor paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. "You remember that?" "I remember everything you said." He picked up his journal again, running his thumb along its worn leather cover. "Question is, did you mean it? Or were you just scared and saying whatever came to mind?" The challenge in his voice sparked something in Eleanor's chest. "I meant every word. I'd rather die free than live as someone's property." "Dying's easy," Silas said quietly. "Living free, that takes work. Every day, every decision, every choice to keep going when things get hard. You sure you're ready for that kind of work?" Eleanor met his steady gaze. "I want to learn." For the first time since she'd awakened, something that might have been approval flickered in his dark eyes. "Finish your stew, then we'll see what you're made of." The next few hours tested Eleanor in ways she'd never imagined. Silas had her practice building a fire from scratch, showing her how to find the right kind of tinder, how to strike flint and steel until her fingers were raw, how to nurse a tiny spark into flames that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. "Fire's not just for warmth," he explained, as Eleanor finally coaxed a flame to life. "It's protection, cooking, signaling, comfort when you're alone in the dark. Master fire, and you've taken the first step toward real independence." Next came water, finding it, purifying it, conserving it. Silas led her to a small spring hidden behind a jumble of rocks, teaching her to read the signs that meant clean water versus water that might kill her. "City water comes from pipes," he said, cupping the clear liquid in his hands. "Out here, you learn to listen to what the land tells you. This spring's been running clean for as long as I've been here, but you test it every time. Look for animal tracks. If they drink here regularly, it's probably safe. But if you see dead animals upstream or the water smells wrong, you keep looking." Eleanor knelt by the spring, trying to memorize everything he told her. The cold mountain water numbed her fingers, but she found herself marveling at its pure taste, nothing like the metallic flavor of the water that came from her father's estate. "How long have you been here?" she asked, as they walked back toward the cabin. Silas was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, 12 years come October. You must have been young when you came up here. 26. Old enough to know better, young enough to think running away would solve anything." There was pain in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Eleanor wanted to ask more, but something in his posture warned her off. Instead, she focused on walking without stumbling, trying to step where he stepped, learning to read the forest floor for obstacles and opportunities. Back at the cabin, Silas handed her his journal. "Can you read?" "Of course I can read," Eleanor said, then immediately regretted the sharp tone. "I'm sorry." "Yes, I can read very well." "Good. Writing's just as important. Up here, you keep track of things, weather patterns, animal behavior, which plants are safe to eat and when they're ready for harvest. Memory's not enough when your life depends on getting it right." Eleanor opened the journal carefully, expecting to find notes about wilderness survival. Instead, she found herself looking at detailed observations, written in a careful, educated hand. September 15th, first snow on the high peaks. Deer moving to lower elevations. Time to check the south-facing slopes for late berries. September 20th, storm brewing in the southwest. Wind pattern suggests 3 days of heavy weather. Secure anything that might blow away. September 25th, found injured hawk near the meadow. Wing broken but setting well. Should be able to release in another week if it continues healing. The entries revealed a man who paid attention to the smallest details of the natural world around him, who cared for injured animals, who could predict weather patterns days in advance. This wasn't the journal of an uneducated hermit. This was the work of someone with deep intelligence and careful training. "You're not what people think you are," Eleanor said softly. Silas took the journal back, his fingers gentle on the worn leather. "People think what they need to think. Keeps them from asking questions I don't want to answer." "What questions?" He was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Questions about why a man with education and prospects chooses to live alone in the mountains. Questions about what he's running from, what he's trying to forget. Eleanor heard the warning in his voice, but found herself stepping closer to whatever pain he was protecting. "Everyone's running from something. At least you had the courage to run toward something better. Silas looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "You think this is better?" "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "You're free. You make your own choices, live by your own rules. You don't have to smile and nod while someone else decides your future. And you don't have to eat if you can't hunt. Don't have to stay warm if you can't keep a fire going. Don't have to stay dry if you can't read weather signs." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Eleanor caught the underlying message. "Freedom's not a gift, Miss Whitmore. It's something you earn every single day. Then teach me how to earn it." Silas studied her face in the firelight, taking in the determination that had replaced her earlier uncertainty. "All right, but we do this right. You learn everything: hunting, tracking, preserving food, reading weather, basic medicine. And you learn it until you can do it in your sleep, because someday your life might depend on it. How long will it take? Depends on you. Some people never learn, no matter how long they try. Others pick it up in a season or two." He paused, then added more quietly, "Question is, how long before they find you up here?" Eleanor had been trying not to think about that. By now, her father would have search parties combing every trail, every town, every possible hiding place. And Morrison, she shuddered to think what Morrison might do when he discovered his expensive bride had vanished. "They'll find me eventually," she admitted, maybe, or maybe they'll decide you're dead and stop looking. Silas poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up toward the roof. "Mountains claim a lot of people who come up here unprepared. Wouldn't be the first time someone just disappeared." The thought should have frightened her, but instead Eleanor found it oddly comforting. If the world below thought she was dead, they'd stop hunting for her. She could build a new life up here, free from the expectations and obligations that had nearly suffocated her. "Would you mind?" she asked. "If I stayed, I mean. If I learned to take care of myself up here." Silas was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "I've been alone for 12 years, Miss Whitmore. Got used to the quiet, the solitude. Having someone else around, it changes things. I could build my own cabin," Eleanor said quickly. "I wouldn't intrude on your privacy. I need time to learn, to figure out who I am when I'm not being what everyone else expects me to be. Building a cabin that'll stand up to a mountain winter takes more than good intentions. Takes knowledge, tools, help from someone who knows what they're doing." Eleanor felt her heart sink. Of course she couldn't just build a cabin from nothing. She was a pampered heiress who'd never even hammered a nail. "I could help you with yours," she said. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever you need, in exchange for letting me stay and teaching me what I need to know." Silas looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something he hadn't noticed before. "You understand what you're asking? To live up here through a mountain winter? No servants, no fancy dresses, no society parties. Just survival day after day." "Yes," Eleanor said firmly. "That's exactly what I want." "All right then." Silas closed his journal and set it aside. "But we do this properly. You pull your weight, you follow my lead when it comes to staying alive, and you don't complain when things get hard. Because they will get hard, Miss Whitmore. Harder than anything you've ever known." Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips, the first genuine smile she'd had in months. "It's Eleanor." "Just Eleanor." "And I won't complain." "We'll see about that," Silas said, but she caught the hint of warmth in his voice. "Tomorrow we start your real education. Tonight you rest and heal. You'll need your strength for what's coming." As Eleanor settled back onto the cot, pulling the wool blankets up to her chin, She felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she wanted to be. Down in the valley, chaos reigned at the Whitmore estate. Charles Whitmore stood in his library, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled after 3 days of organizing search parties and fielding questions from increasingly hostile visitors. His prized railroad watch lay open on the desk, its steady ticking a mockery of time slipping away without answers. "Nothing, sir," reported Jake Morrison, Bartholomew's younger brother and the leader of the latest search party. "We've covered every trail within 20 miles, checked every line shack and hunting cabin we could find. It's like she just vanished into thin air." Bartholomew Morrison paced behind Charles's desk like a caged wolf, his thin face twisted with barely controlled rage. "She didn't vanish. Someone took her, or she's hiding somewhere, playing games like a spoiled child. My daughter is not," Charles began. "Your daughter has cost me considerable embarrassment," Morrison cut him off. "The engagement announcement was in newspapers from here to Denver. Do you have any idea what this makes me look like?" Charles bit back his first response. The truth was, he cared more about Eleanor's safety than Morrison's wounded pride. But their business arrangements were too valuable to jeopardize with honesty. "We'll find her, Bartholomew. She can't have gone far. She could be dead by now," Jake Morrison said bluntly. "City girl alone in the wilderness? Mountain lions, bears, cliffs in the dark. She's not dead," Morrison snapped. "She's too stubborn to die. No, she's out there somewhere, probably laughing at all of us scrambling around looking for her." Martha entered with a tea service, her movements careful and controlled. She'd been questioned repeatedly about Eleanor's disappearance, but had revealed nothing beyond expressing appropriate concern for her missing charge. "Any word from the sheriff's men?" Charles asked her. "They're checking the mining camps up north," Martha replied evenly. "Some thought maybe she'd headed toward the railroad to catch a train out of the territory." Morrison's laugh was bitter. "With what money? You said yourself nothing was missing from her room except the clothes on her back." "Actually," Martha said carefully, "I believe some of her jewelry might be missing. Nothing too valuable, just some pieces her mother left her. It was a lie, but a useful one. Eleanor had taken nothing but the clothes she wore, and Martha's small savings. But if the searchers believed she had money, they might focus their efforts on towns and railroad stations rather than the wilderness." Charles seized on this possibility. Of course, she could have traded jewelry for passage to California or back east to her aunt in Boston. "Then why haven't we heard anything from the railroad?" Morrison demanded. "I've had men checking every station between here and Denver." "Maybe she was smart enough to avoid the main lines," Jake suggested. "Plenty of freight trains that don't ask questions about passengers who can pay." Meanwhile, 15 miles away in the high country, Eleanor was discovering that learning to survive required muscles she'd never used and calluses she'd never needed. Silas had begun her education in earnest, starting with the most basic skills and building from there. "Hold it steady," he instructed, as Eleanor struggled with a hand plane, trying to smooth a piece of pine he'd cut for kindling. "The wood wants to split clean if you work with the grain, not against it." Eleanor's arms ached from the unfamiliar motion, and her hands were already blistered despite the work gloves Silas had given her. But slowly, she was beginning to see how the rough lumber could be shaped into something useful. "Like this?" she asked, adjusting her grip. "Better. You're learning to listen to what the wood tells you." Silas watched her work for a moment, then nodded approval. "Everything up here has its own voice. Wood, stone, water, weather. City folk spend so much time talking they forget how to listen." Eleanor paused in her planing, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Is that why you came up here? To learn how to listen?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I came up here to stop hearing things I didn't want to hear anymore. The listening part came later." "What kind of things?" "Orders, gunfire, screaming." The words came out flat and matter-of-fact, but Eleanor caught the pain beneath them. "War has a way of filling your head with sounds that never quite go away." Eleanor set down the plane, giving him her full attention. You were a soldier, Union Army, fought from Bull Run to Appomattox, and most everywhere in between. Silas picked up a piece of carved wood from his workbench, a small comb with intricate patterns worked into the handle. Came home to find everything I'd fought to protect was gone. Your family, wife and daughter. Fever took them the winter before the war ended. I was off playing soldier while they died alone. His fingers traced the carved patterns on the comb, gentle as a caress. Made this for my daughter's 5th birthday. Never got to give it to her. Eleanor's heart ached for the pain in his voice. I'm so sorry. World's full of sorrow. Adding mine to the pile doesn't change anything. Silas set the comb aside and picked up his own plane, demonstrating the smooth, practiced motion she was trying to master. Point is, I understand what it means to run away from a life that doesn't fit anymore. Is that what I'm doing? Running away? That's what you started doing. Question is, what are you running toward? Eleanor considered this as she resumed her work. The physical labor was harder than anything she'd ever attempted, but there was something deeply satisfying about shaping raw wood into something useful with her own hands. No servants, no intermediaries, just her will and effort making something real. I think I'm running toward myself, she said finally. The person I might be if I wasn't trying to be what everyone else expected. And what kind of person is that? Eleanor smiled, surprising herself with the certainty of her answer. Someone who can build her own fire and find her own water. Someone who doesn't need permission to make choices about her own life. Those are good things to be, Silas agreed. But being independent doesn't mean being alone. Even up here I depend on others sometimes, trade with trappers, buy supplies in town. Nobody survives completely on their own. I don't want to be completely alone, Eleanor said softly. I just want to choose my own company. Their eyes met across the workbench, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared understanding. Here was a man who'd also fled from a world that demanded too much and gave too little. Here was someone who understood the price of freedom and was willing to pay it. Silas cleared his throat and returned his attention to the wood in his hands. Afternoon's getting on. We should check the snares I set yesterday, see if we caught anything for dinner. Eleanor followed him into the forest, trying to step quietly as he'd taught her. The snares were simple but clever contraptions. Wire loops positioned on animal trails, designed to catch rabbits and other small game without requiring constant vigilance. First rule of hunting, Silas explained as they approached the first snare, never kill more than you can use. Take what you need, leave the rest for tomorrow. The snare held a plump rabbit, dispatched quickly and cleanly. Eleanor felt a moment of sadness for the small life, but also gratitude. This animal would feed them tonight, and its fur could be used for winter clothing. Does it get easier? She asked as Silas reset the snare. Taking life for food? No, and it shouldn't. The day you stop feeling grateful for what you take is the day you stop being human. He shouldered the rabbit and moved toward the next snare. But you learn to make the death count for something. Use every part, waste nothing. Remember that this animal gave its life so you could keep yours. The second snare was empty, but the third held another rabbit. As they walked back toward the cabin, Eleanor found herself thinking about the difference between this and the elaborate meals served at her father's table. There, meat appeared magically from the kitchen, with no thought given to the animals that had died to provide it. Here she was intimately connected to every aspect of survival. Silas, she said as they neared the cabin, the comb you made for your daughter. It's beautiful work. You could sell pieces like that. Don't need money up here. But if you ever wanted to come down to town, or if you needed supplies you couldn't make yourself, I go to town twice a year, Silas said firmly. Buy what I can't make, trade what I don't need, and get back up here as fast as possible. Eleanor heard the warning in his voice, but pressed on. I just meant that you have skills people would value. You don't have to hide them away up here. Silas stopped walking and turned to face her. Miss Eleanor, I didn't come up here to build a business or impress anybody with my woodworking. I came here to disappear, but you didn't disappear, Eleanor said gently. You're still here, still creating beautiful things, still helping injured hawks and lost heiresses. Maybe it's time to stop hiding from the world. And maybe, Silas said, his voice carrying a hint of steel, you don't understand what I'm hiding from. The words hung between them in the cooling mountain air. Eleanor realized she'd pushed too far, too fast. Whatever had driven Silas to this mountain retreat was deeper and more painful than the simple grief of losing his family. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean to pry. Silas's expression softened slightly. You meant well. But some doors are better left closed. That evening, as they prepared the rabbits for dinner, Eleanor found herself studying Silas's hands as he worked. They were skilled hands, scarred from years of hard work, but capable of incredible gentleness. The way he cleaned the meat, the careful attention he paid to preserving the fur, the respect he showed for the animals that would feed them, all of it spoke to a deep understanding of life and death and the responsibility that came with survival. Where did you learn all this? She asked, as he showed her how to properly skin the rabbits. Some from my father. He was a farmer before the war took our land. Some from other soldiers who grew up hunting. Most of it from 12 years of making mistakes and learning from them. Silas guided her hands, showing her the proper angle for the knife. Trial and error's a harsh teacher, but it sticks. As they worked together in the growing darkness, Eleanor felt a contentment she'd never known in her father's mansion. Her hands were dirty, her dress was stained, and tomorrow would bring more hard work and new challenges. But for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she wanted to be. The comb Silas had carved for his lost daughter lay on the workbench nearby, its intricate patterns catching the firelight. It was a thing of beauty created from love and loss, hope and memory. Like the man who'd made it, it represented the possibility of finding grace in the midst of grief. Eleanor picked up the comb carefully, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Would you teach me to carve? Silas looked up from his work, surprise flickering in his dark eyes. It's not easy work. Takes patience, steady hands. I have time to learn patience. And my hands are getting steadier every day. For a long moment, he studied her face in the firelight. Then slowly he nodded. All right, but we start simple. No fancy patterns until you've mastered the basics. Eleanor smiled, setting the comb gently back in its place. Tomorrow would bring new lessons in survival, new challenges to overcome. But tonight, she was content to sit by the fire with a man who understood the value of beautiful things created by careful hands, learning to find her own place in a world that had once seemed impossibly vast and frightening. Outside, the wind sang through the pine trees, and somewhere in the valley below, search parties continued their futile hunt for a woman who had already found exactly what she was looking for. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor's arrival at the mountain cabin, and the transformation was remarkable. Her soft hands now bore calluses from working with wood and rope. Her pale complexion had taken on a healthy glow from days spent outdoors. Most importantly, her movements had acquired the quiet confidence that came from learning to trust her own capabilities. This morning, she knelt beside a patch of late-blooming wildflowers near the cabin, carefully pressing a perfect mountain aster between the pages of Silas's journal. The purple petals were delicate as silk, with golden centers that seemed to hold sunshine. She'd asked permission to start a collection, a record of the plants she was learning to identify for food. Medicine and simple beauty. That one's good for stomach troubles, Silas said, settling beside her with 2 cups of pine needle tea. Brew the leaves into tea, but don't use too much, or you'll make the problem worse instead of better. Eleanor accepted the warm cup gratefully. The morning air held the sharp bite of approaching winter, though the days were still pleasant. How do you remember it all? Every plant, every animal sign, every weather pattern. Same way you learned to read books. Practice, repetition, and making mistakes until you get it right. Silas watched her carefully close the journal, protecting the pressed flower. Your father teach you to read? My mother, actually. Before she died, Eleanor smoothed her hand over the journal's leather cover. She said books were windows to worlds we might never see otherwise. I used to think she meant faraway places, Europe, the Orient. I never imagined she might have meant this. This what? Eleanor gestured at the vast landscape spread below them, endless forest rolling towards snow-capped peaks, meadows where elk grazed in the morning mist, a world that operated by laws older and more honest than anything human society had devised. Freedom, she said simply. The kind of life where your choices matter because you're the one who has to live with the consequences. Silas studied her profile as she spoke, noting the strength that had replaced the uncertainty he'd seen in her face that first morning. You've adapted faster than I expected. Most city folks give up after the first week when the romance wears off and the real work begins. Most city folks probably had something to go back to. Eleanor took a sip of the bitter tea, no longer grimacing at its medicinal taste. I burned my bridges the night I walked away from that engagement. Even if I wanted to return, which I don't, there's nothing waiting for me but shame and a life I couldn't bear to live. Your father might forgive. My father sees me as a business asset that went missing. When I'm found, if I'm found, I'll be locked away until I agree to marry Morrison or someone like him. Eleanor's voice carried no bitterness, just the calm certainty of someone who understood her situation completely. I chose freedom over safety. I can't regret that choice. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking their tea and watching a red-tailed hawk circle high overhead. Eleanor had learned to read the bird's flight patterns. Today it was hunting, not just soaring for pleasure. Somewhere below in the grass, small creatures were adjusting their behavior, freezing or fleeing based on instincts honed over countless generations. Silas, Eleanor said carefully, may I ask you something personal? His posture tensed slightly, but he nodded. The war? How long ago did it end for you? Officially, April of 1865, when Lee surrendered. For me, Silas was quiet for a long moment. Some wars never really end. They just move inside your head and keep fighting there. Eleanor waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. I was a sharpshooter, he continued finally. Good at it too. Could put a bullet through a playing card at 500 yards. My commanding officers were always praising my skill, talking about how many enemy soldiers I'd eliminated, how much my marksmanship contributed to our victories. He paused, staring out at the peaceful landscape. Took me years to understand that. Every one of those targets was somebody's son, somebody's father, somebody's brother. Men with families waiting for them to come home, dreams they'd never get to fulfill. Silas's hands tightened around his cup. By the time I figured that out, I'd killed so many I stopped counting. Eleanor felt her heart ache for the pain in his voice. You were a soldier. You were following orders, fighting for something you believed in. Was I? Or was I just good at killing and too young to understand what that meant? Silas shook his head. When I came home and found my family dead, part of me thought it was justice. Like God was evening the scales for all the families I'd destroyed. That's not justice, Eleanor said firmly. That's tragedy. The war, your family's death, the guilt you've been carrying, none of it was your fault. Maybe not. But that doesn't make it easier to live with. Eleanor reached out and touched his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his years in exile. Is that why you stay up here? Because you think you don't deserve forgiveness? Silas looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. I stay up here because it's the only place I've found peace, the only place where the ghosts don't follow. But they did follow you, didn't they? That's why you keep that journal, why you notice every detail of the world around you. You're trying to balance the scales, all that death you caused, against all the life you're now protecting and preserving. The observation hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Eleanor realized she was still holding his hand and started to pull away, but Silas's fingers tightened around hers. How did you get so wise? He asked softly. I'm not wise. I'm just someone who understands what it means to carry guilt for things beyond your control. Eleanor thought of her mother, dying young while Eleanor grew up privileged and protected. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. They sat together as the morning warmed around them, hands linked, both lost in thoughts of the past and possibilities for the future. Eleanor had never felt so connected to another person. not through shared society or family obligation, but through the deeper recognition of shared struggle and mutual understanding. "Eleanor," Silas said eventually, "there's something you should know about why I really brought you here instead of taking you back to your father." Eleanor's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "That first night, when I found you collapsed in the forest, you were delirious from exhaustion, talking in your sleep. You kept saying, 'Please don't make me marry him, please don't make me,' over and over, like you were trying to convince someone who wouldn't listen." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't remember that. I figured any woman desperate, enough to run into the wilderness rather than marry someone, probably had good reason." Silas's thumb traced across her knuckles. "So I decided to give you a choice your family wouldn't. Time to figure out what you really wanted, instead of what other people wanted for you. And what if what I want isn't what's best for me? Then at least it'll be your mistake to make." Eleanor laughed, surprised by the sound. "That might be the most liberating thing anyone has ever said to me." "Freedom's not about making the right choices," Silas said, his own lips quirking in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "It's about having the right to make your own choices, even if they're wrong." As if summoned by their laughter, a doe stepped delicately into the clearing below them, followed by a spotted fawn. Mother and child moved with the fluid grace of creatures perfectly adapted to their environment, alert but unafraid in their own territory. "She's beautiful," Eleanor whispered. "First fawn I've seen this close to the cabin," Silas murmured back. "Usually they stay deeper in the forest until the young ones are stronger." They watched in fascination as the doe taught her fawn to identify safe plants, nudging the youngster away from anything potentially harmful. It was a master class in survival, passed down through instinct and careful observation. "Look," Eleanor breathed. The fawn had wandered close enough to notice the pressed flower in Eleanor's open journal. Curious, it stretched its neck toward the bright purple petals, then startled back to its mother's side when Eleanor shifted slightly. "Even the wild things appreciate beauty," Silas observed quietly. Eleanor carefully closed the journal, preserving both the flower and the moment. The deer moved on, disappearing into the forest as silently as they'd arrived. But the magic of the encounter lingered. "I want to learn to carve flowers like that," Eleanor said suddenly. "Asters and columbines and Indian paintbrush, all the beautiful things that grow up here. Flowers are hard to carve, lots of delicate detail work. Then I'll start with something simpler and work my way up." Eleanor's voice held the same determination that had carried her away from her father's house and up into these mountains. "I have time to learn." Silas smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "Yes, you do. We both do." As they walked back toward the cabin, Eleanor realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, her desperate flight from an unwanted marriage had become something else entirely. She was no longer running away from her old life. She was running towards something new and infinitely more precious. The mountain aster pressed between the pages of Silas's journal would serve as a reminder of this morning, this moment, when two damaged souls had found in each other the courage to believe in beauty again. And perhaps, Eleanor thought as she watched Silas gather kindling with practiced efficiency, in the possibility of love growing in the most unexpected places. October brought the first serious storm to the high country, and with it, Eleanor's real education in mountain survival. She woke to the sound of wind howling around the cabin like a living thing, rattling the windows and sending pine needles skittering across the roof. "Storm's going to be a bad one," Silas said, already dressed and checking their supplies. "Could last 3 days, maybe more. We need to make sure everything's secured before it gets worse." Eleanor pulled on her warmest clothes, wool pants and a thick sweater she'd traded her silk petticoat for during Silas's last trip to town. Amazing how quickly priorities shifted when survival depended on practicality over fashion. Outside, the world had transformed overnight. Heavy clouds pressed down on the peaks, and the air tasted of snow and electricity. The wind whipped Eleanor's hair around her face as she helped Silas secure anything that might blow away. "The horses?" she asked, having to shout over the wind. "Already moved them to the sheltered pen behind the cabin. They'll be fine as long as we keep them fed and watered." Silas tested the rope holding down a tarp covering their winter wood supply. "It's us I'm worried about." As if summoned by his words, the first snowflakes began to fall, not the gentle flutter of a typical mountain snow, but hard, driving pellets that stung exposed skin. Within minutes, the flakes grew larger and the fall grew heavier until they could barely see 20 feet in any direction. They retreated to the cabin just as the storm unleashed its full fury. Eleanor had never experienced anything like it, the constant roar of wind, the cabin creaking and swaying as gusts tested its construction, the strange half-light that made afternoon feel like twilight. "Is the cabin strong enough?" she asked, trying to keep anxiety out of her voice. "Built it myself, using techniques I learned from a trapper who'd survived 40 winters up here." Silas added wood to the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. "She'll hold, but we might be stuck inside for a while." By evening, snow had drifted halfway up the windows. The world outside had disappeared entirely, leaving them isolated in their small circle of warmth and light. Eleanor found herself grateful for the hours she'd spent learning to tend a fire properly. Tonight, their lives might depend on keeping the flames burning. "Tell me about your family," she said, as they sat by the hearth sharing a dinner of preserved venison and vegetables from Silas's root cellar. Silas was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "Sarah was 19 when we married. Prettiest girl in 3 counties, with a laugh that could make you believe anything was possible." He pulled something from his pocket, a small military medal tarnished with age. "She used to say I was too serious, that I needed to learn how to play again after the war." Eleanor looked at the medal he held, a bronze star with ribbons faded by time and handling. "What's that for?" "Valor at Gettysburg. Saved my commanding officer when his horse was shot out from under him." Silas's laugh was bitter. "They give you medals for killing people efficiently. Call it heroism. Maybe it was heroism. Maybe you saved more lives by ending the ones you did. Maybe." Sarah used to say something similar. She'd tell me that good men sometimes have to do terrible things so that innocent people can sleep safely. He turned the medal over in his hands. "She never knew how many men I'd killed. I never told her. And your daughter?" Silas's face softened completely. "Emma. She was 3 when I left for the war, 5 when..." He stopped, unable to finish. "She had Sarah's laugh and my stubborn streak. Could climb any tree in the county, catch fireflies with her bare hands, ask more questions in an hour than most people think of in a lifetime." Eleanor reached for his free hand, offering what comfort she could. "What happened to them?" "Scarlet fever. The winter of 1864. I was off fighting in Georgia while my girls were dying alone in Ohio." Silas closed his fingers around the medal. "Got the letter 3 months after they were buried. By the time I made it home, there was nothing left but graves and memories." "Oh, Silas." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. "I'm so sorry. Sold everything, spent 2 years drinking myself toward the grave, then sobered up long enough to realize I was dishonoring their memory by throwing my life away." He looked up at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "So I came up here to figure out how to live with what I'd lost. And have you? Figured it out, I mean. I thought I had, until you showed up and reminded me what it felt like to care about someone again." The words hung between them like a confession. Eleanor felt her heart speed up, recognizing the shift in their relationship that had been building for weeks. "Silas, I know it's not fair," he said quickly. "You're young, beautiful, educated. You could have any life you wanted once this mess with your father gets sorted out. You don't need to tie yourself to a broken-down soldier with more ghosts than sense. What if I'm not looking for fair?" Eleanor moved closer to him on the rough wooden bench. "What if I'm looking for real?" Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, but inside the cabin time seemed suspended. Eleanor studied Silas's face in the firelight, the strong jaw shadowed with whiskers. The eyes that had seen too much, but still held kindness. The mouth that spoke hard truths with gentle words. "You don't know what you're saying," he murmured. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Eleanor reached up to touch his cheek, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her palm. "I know what it's like to live with ghosts, Silas. I know what it's like to feel responsible for someone else's death." "Your mother?" "I was 8 when she died, old enough to understand that she was sick, too young to do anything about it. For years, I blamed myself for not being able to save her, for not being good enough to make her want to fight harder to stay alive." Silas covered her hand with his. "Children aren't responsible for their parents' deaths, and soldiers aren't responsible for orders they followed in wartime." Eleanor leaned closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "We're both carrying guilt for things beyond our control. Maybe it's time to start forgiving ourselves." "Eleanor." She silenced him by pressing her lips to his, soft and tentative at first, then with growing certainty as he responded. The kiss tasted of pine needle tea and promises, of loneliness finally finding its match and two damaged souls discovering they could heal each other. When they finally broke apart, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything." "Good," Eleanor whispered. Everything needed changing. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, but Eleanor barely noticed. She was too busy learning the language of Silas's smiles, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the gentle strength of his hands as he taught her to carve her first simple flower, a rough approximation of the mountain aster from her collection. "Patience," he murmured, guiding her knife along the wood grain. "Let the wood tell you where it wants to be cut." Eleanor found herself concentrating not just on the carving, but on the warmth of his body behind hers, the steady sound of his breathing, the way he smelled of wood smoke and pine. When had she started thinking of this cabin as home? When had this man become essential to her happiness? "Tell me about your dreams," she said as they worked together by lamplight. "Before the war, before everything went wrong, what did you want your life to be?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering. "I wanted to be a teacher. Loved books, loved learning. Thought I could make a difference by passing knowledge on to the next generation." "You could still do that. Who's going to hire a hermit with blood on his hands to teach their children? Someone who understands that the best teachers are often the ones who've learned from their own mistakes." Eleanor set down her carving and turned to face him. "You've taught me more in a month than I learned in 23 years of formal education. That's different." "You're what? Special? Different? Or just someone who needed to learn what you had to teach?" Eleanor smiled. "There are other people out there who need what you know, Silas, about survival, about resilience, about finding peace after trauma. You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. Not easy, but simple." Eleanor picked up the medal he'd left on the work table, studying the worn bronze. "This represents one part of your story, but it's not the whole story. You're also the man who nurses injured hawks back to health, who carves beautiful things with his hands, who gave a spoiled heiress a chance to discover who she really was." Silas took the medal from her fingers and looked at it for a long moment. Then with deliberate motion he placed it in the small wooden box where he kept his few valuables. "Maybe," he said quietly, "it's time to stop carrying that particular piece of the past." Eleanor felt something shift in the space between them, a letting go, a choosing of hope over guilt. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but inside the cabin, something stronger than weather was building. That night, as they lay together on the narrow cot, Eleanor in his arms for the first time, both of them fully clothed, but emotionally naked, she understood that she had found what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just freedom from her father's plans, but freedom to choose love on her own terms. "Are you sure about this?" Silas asked softly, his breath warm against her hair. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Eleanor whispered back. The medal lay hidden in its box, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, two people who had lost everything they thought mattered had found something infinitely more precious in each other's arms. Eleanor was gathering firewood near the creek when she heard voices drifting up from the valley below. She froze, her arms full of split pine, straining to make out words over the sound of running water. Male voices, multiple speakers, and they were getting closer. Moving as quietly as Silas had taught her, she crept to the edge of the clearing and peered through the trees. 3 men on horseback were following the creek upstream, their voices carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Tracks lead this way. Fresh ones too," one was saying. "Could be anybody. Trappers, hunters, drifters," replied another, "or kidnappers hiding their victim where nobody thinks to look." This voice was different, educated, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. Eleanor's blood went cold. Bartholomew Morrison. She dropped the firewood and ran for the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silas looked up from his carving as she burst through the door, immediately reading the panic in her face. "Search party," she gasped. "Morrison's with them. They're following the creek." Silas was on his feet instantly, moving with the fluid efficiency of a man accustomed to danger.
"How far?"
"Maybe half a mile downstream." "Silas, if they find me here with you, they won't." He was already gathering essential supplies, stuffing them into a pack with practiced speed. "Back way out through the ridge trail. We can be 10 miles deep in the wilderness before they reach the cabin." Eleanor's mind raced. What if we're wrong? What if they're just passing through? "You want to bet your life on that?" Silas shouldered his rifle and handed Eleanor her coat. "Because that's what you'd be doing." As if summoned by his words, a shout echoed from below. "Smoke! There's smoke coming from up ahead." Silas cursed under his breath. Too late for the ridge trail. Root cellar. He led Eleanor to a corner of the cabin where a heavy wooden panel covered what she'd assumed was just part of the floor. Beneath it lay a carefully constructed hiding space, barely large enough for 2 people, but lined with blankets and supplied with water and dried food. "You built this for situations like this?" Eleanor asked as they climbed down. "Built it for different situations, but it'll serve." Silas pulled the panel closed above them, plunging them into darkness. "Whatever happens, stay quiet. Don't come out until I give the all clear, no matter what you hear." They huddled together in the cramped space, Eleanor's ear pressed against Silas's chest to muffle the sound of her racing heart. Above them, they could hear the approaching horses, the jingle of spurs, voices growing louder as the search party reached the cabin. Well, came Morrison's voice, clear as a bell through the floorboards. "What have we here?" Heavy footsteps crossed the cabin floor directly overhead. Eleanor heard the scrape of chairs being moved, the clank of pots being examined, the deliberate sounds of men searching every corner. "Someone's been living here," said an unfamiliar voice. "And recently, too. Fire's still warm. 2 plates on the table," observed another. 2 cups. Either our hermit's got company, or he's crazier than folks think. Morrison's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Oh, I don't think Silas Kane is crazy at all. I think he's exactly where we expected to find him." Eleanor felt Silas tense beside her. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Morrison spoke as if he'd known exactly where to look. "Search every inch," Morrison commanded. "Look for anything that might tell us where they've gone." "They?" came the question. "You think the girl's actually up here?" "I think," Morrison said slowly, "that Miss Eleanor Whitmore has been playing a very dangerous game. And I think our mountain man has been helping her play it. More footsteps, more searching." Eleanor heard her heart beating so loud she was certain the men above could hear it too. Then Morrison spoke again, and his words turned her blood to ice. "Jake, hand me that telegram from my saddlebags." Papers rustled overhead. Then Morrison's voice, reading aloud, "Have confirmed Eleanor Whitmore's location. Stop mountain man Silas Kane, harboring her in cabin near. Eagles Peak stop, reliable witness, places them together. Stop, advise how to proceed. Stop." Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. Someone had betrayed them. Someone had known exactly where to find them and had sent word to Morrison. "Who's your reliable witness?" asked the man called Jake. "Someone with very good reason to want Miss Whitmore found and returned to her proper place in society." Morrison's voice held satisfaction and menace in equal measure. "Someone who understands that young ladies need guidance from their betters." The old housekeeper. Martha Henderson has served the Whitmore family faithfully for decades. She understands that Eleanor's little rebellion has gone on long enough. Eleanor felt as if she'd been stabbed. Martha, dear kind Martha, who'd helped her escape, who'd given her money and encouragement, had betrayed her to Morrison. But why? As if reading her thoughts, Morrison continued. Of course, Mrs. Henderson needed some convincing to share what she knew. Amazing how cooperative people become when you explain exactly what might happen to their grandchildren if they don't help locate missing persons. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. Morrison had threatened Martha's family to get information about Eleanor's whereabouts. The poor woman had been forced to choose between Eleanor's freedom and her own grandchildren's safety. So what's the plan? Jake asked.
Storm the place?
No need for dramatics, we wait. They'll come back eventually, probably after dark, thinking we've moved on. Mountain folk are predictable that way. Morrison's voice moved across the cabin as he spoke. Besides, I want to have a little conversation with Mr. Kane before we conclude our business. About what? About the serious crime of kidnapping a respectable young woman. About the even more serious crime of compromising her virtue while holding her against her will. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. She hadn't been kidnapped, and she certainly hadn't been held against her will. But she realized with growing horror that Morrison was constructing a narrative that would destroy both her and Silas. You think Kane forced himself on her? I think, Morrison said carefully, that when we find Miss Whitmore, she'll be in such a state of trauma and gratitude for her rescue that she'll agree to whatever story best protects her reputation. And I think Mr. Kane will find himself facing a choice between a rope and a bullet. What if she won't cooperate? What if she tells people she came up here willingly? Morrison's laugh was like breaking glass. Who's going to believe the hysterical claims of a woman who's been held captive in the wilderness for weeks? Clearly, the poor thing has been driven half mad by her ordeal. She'll need careful tending and close supervision to recover from her trauma. Eleanor understood now. Morrison wasn't just hunting for her. He was creating a situation where she would have no choice but to marry him to save her reputation and Silas's life. Her voluntary disappearance would become a kidnapping. Her freely chosen love would become assault. And Silas would be painted as a violent criminal who deserved whatever punishment Morrison chose to inflict. Beside her in the darkness, Silas's breathing had gone deadly quiet. Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from his body like heat from a forge. He understood the trap as clearly as she did. How long do we wait? Jake asked. As long as it takes. I've come too far and invested too much to let a spoiled heiress and a broken-down soldier ruin my plans. Morrison's voice hardened. Charles Whitmore owes me more money than he can repay. This marriage was supposed to settle those debts. If his daughter thinks she can escape her obligations by running off with some hermit, she's about to learn otherwise. Eleanor's mind reeled. Her father owed Morrison money? The engagement hadn't been about business partnerships or social advancement. It had been about debt collection. She was collateral in a financial arrangement gone wrong. What about Kane? Even if you paint him as a kidnapper, some folks might ask awkward questions. War hero goes bad makes for good newspaper stories. War hero? Morrison's voice dripped scorn. Silas Kane is no hero. He's a deserter who ran from his unit during the siege of Atlanta. Court-martialed in absentia, stripped of rank, marked as a coward who abandoned his fellow soldiers when they needed him most. Eleanor felt Silas go rigid beside her. Even in the darkness, she could sense his shock and outrage. How do you know all this? Jake asked. Because I make it my business to know things about people who might cause me trouble. Kane's been hiding up here for 12 years, but military records are forever. One telegram to the War Department was all it took to get his complete service record. So, we're hunting a deserter and a kidnapper. Sounds like we're doing the territory a service. Exactly. When this is over, Silas Kane will be remembered as a violent criminal who got exactly what he deserved. And Eleanor Whitmore will be a grateful bride who owes her rescue to her devoted fiancé. Eleanor closed her eyes, fighting waves of nausea. Morrison had twisted everything. her escape, her love for Silas, even Silas's military service, into a web of lies designed to trap them both. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Eleanor felt something else rising in her chest. Rage. Pure, clean anger at the injustice of it all. At Morrison's casual cruelty, at a world that would believe his lies simply because he was a wealthy white man with social standing. She would not go quietly into the cage Morrison had built for her. And she would not let Silas pay the price for her freedom. Above them, the search continued, but Eleanor was no longer listening to Morrison's voice. Instead, she was planning, thinking through every skill Silas had taught her, every piece of wilderness knowledge she'd absorbed, every advantage they might have in this deadly game. Morrison might have money and men, and the backing of society's prejudices. But Eleanor had something he'd never expected and couldn't understand. The determination of a woman who'd finally learned to fight for what she loved. The battle for her freedom was just beginning. They waited in the cramped darkness for what felt like hours, listening to Morrison's men systematically destroy Silas's carefully organized home. The sound of breaking pottery, overturned furniture, and torn fabric drifted down through the floorboards like a catalogue of violation. Nothing useful here, Jake finally reported. If they were planning to come back, they didn't leave any clues about when or where. They'll be back, Morrison said with cold certainty. This is Kane's sanctuary. He won't abandon it permanently for some spoiled city girl. Eleanor felt Silas's hand find hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. In that simple touch, she read both apology and determination. He blamed himself for bringing this danger into her life, but he was also preparing to fight. "We'll set up camp in the clearing," Morrison continued. "Jake, you and Tom take first watch. I want to know the moment anyone approaches this cabin. What if they don't come back tonight? Then we wait another night, and another after that if necessary." Morrison's voice carried the patience of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I've invested too much in this arrangement to let it slip away now." Footsteps moved toward the door, followed by the sound of horses being led away from the cabin. Eleanor counted the men's voices, 3 total, including Morrison. Not impossible odds, but challenging enough when they were armed and expecting trouble. Silas waited until the sounds faded completely before carefully lifting the wooden panel above them. Pale afternoon light filtered into their hiding place, and Eleanor had to blink several times before her eyes adjusted. The cabin looked like a battlefield. Her pressed flower collection lay scattered across the floor, delicate petals crushed under boot heels. Silas's carving tools were scattered, his furniture overturned, his carefully preserved supplies dumped and trampled. But it was the sight of his father's compass, broken and lying in pieces near the fireplace, that made Eleanor's hands clench into fists. The brass case was cracked, the needle bent beyond repair, a deliberate act of destruction that spoke to Morrison's casual cruelty. "I'm sorry," Silas said quietly, kneeling to gather the pieces. "This compass guided my father through 30 years of farming, guided me through 4 years of war. It was supposed to guide us to safety." Eleanor knelt beside him, carefully collecting the scattered fragments. "It has guided us to safety. Look." She pointed to the compass needle, which, despite being bent, still pointed stubbornly north. "It's damaged, but it's not defeated. Just like us." Silas looked at her with something approaching wonder. "How are you so calm?" "Morrison's got us trapped. He's planning to destroy both our reputations. And he's made it clear he intends to see me dead." "Because," Eleanor said, standing and moving to the window to scan the clearing below, "I've finally figured out what I'm fighting for. Not just my freedom anymore, our freedom, our future. The right to choose love over obligation." Through the window, she could see Morrison's camp about 100 yards away. 3 men, 3 horses, supplies for an extended siege. They'd positioned themselves with clear sight lines to all approaches to the cabin, confident in their tactical advantage. "Eleanor," Silas said carefully, "there's something you need to know about what Morrison said. About my military record." She turned to face him, reading the shame and uncertainty in his dark eyes. "Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It does matter. If there's any truth to his claims about desertion, is there? Eleanor interrupted. Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the broken compass in his hands. I left my unit during the Atlanta campaign, but not the way he made it sound. Eleanor waited, giving him space to tell the story in his own way. We'd been fighting for weeks, taking heavy casualties. I was the best marksman in the regiment, so they kept sending me on special assignments, picking off enemy officers, disrupting supply lines. I was good at it, maybe too good. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Then I got word that Sarah and Emma were sick. Scarlet fever was spreading through our town, and Sarah's letters were getting more desperate. She needed me, and I hadn't seen my family in over a year. Eleanor felt her heart ache for the impossible choice he'd faced. So I requested leave, emergency compassionate leave to care for my dying family. My commanding officer denied it, said the mission was too important, that I couldn't be spared. Silas's voice hardened. He said a soldier's duty was to his unit, not his family. What did you do? I left anyway. Went AWOL for 3 weeks, trying to get home to Ohio, but the trains were disrupted, the roads were dangerous, and by the time I made it back to my unit, Sarah and Emma were already dead. Eleanor moved to sit beside him, offering what comfort she could. My commanding officer was furious. Said I'd abandoned my post during a critical operation, that men had died because I wasn't there to provide cover. He recommended a court-martial for desertion, but you came back. Doesn't that count for something? Apparently not. The war ended before the court-martial could be convened, so they just marked my record and discharged me without honor. Silas looked up at her, his eyes reflecting years of carried guilt. So Morrison wasn't lying. I'm technically a deserter. Eleanor felt anger flare in her chest, not at Silas, but at a system that would condemn a man for trying to save his dying family. You're not a deserter. You're a man who chose love over duty when the army forced you to choose between them. The law doesn't see it that way. Then the law is wrong. Eleanor stood, pacing to the window again. Morrison's using your military record to justify whatever he's planning to do to you. But what really happened doesn't make you a coward or a criminal. It makes you human. Below in the clearing, she could see Morrison giving orders to his men. Even at this distance, his gestures conveyed arrogance and authority. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, confident that wealth and social position would carry the day. Silas, Eleanor said slowly, an idea beginning to form. What if Morrison's confidence is also his weakness? What do you mean? He's so certain he can control this situation, so sure that his version of events will be believed, that he might not be prepared for us to fight back in ways he doesn't expect. Eleanor turned back to face him, her mind racing through possibilities. He's counting on us being passive victims. What if we're not? Eleanor, they're armed and they outnumber us. This isn't some parlor game where wit and determination automatically win the day. No. But it's not a simple manhunt either. Eleanor began gathering useful items from the wreckage: rope, a hunting knife, some of the food that hadn't been destroyed. Morrison needs me alive and relatively undamaged to maintain his story, and he needs to kill you in a way that looks justified. That doesn't sound like an advantage. It is, though. It means he can't just shoot us on sight. He needs to create the right circumstances, the right witnesses. That gives us room to maneuver. Silas watched her work, noting the determination that had replaced her earlier fear. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we don't wait for them to come to us. We go to them, but on our terms. Eleanor shouldered the pack she'd assembled. Morrison wants to paint you as a violent kidnapper. Let's give him a chance to see what real violence looks like when someone threatens the people we love. Eleanor, that's dangerous. Of course it is. But so is staying here and hoping they'll eventually give up and go home. Eleanor moved to where Silas kept his rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. You've been hiding from your past for 12 years. I've been hiding from my future for my entire life. Maybe it's time we both stopped hiding. Silas studied her face, seeing in it the same steely resolve that had carried her away from her father's house and up into these mountains. What did you have in mind? Eleanor smiled. and for the first time since she'd heard Morrison's voice in the valley, she felt truly dangerous. "I'm thinking it's time for Eleanor Whitmore to disappear completely, and for someone new to take her place." As the sun began to set behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the clearing, Eleanor and Silas prepared for the fight of their lives. Morrison might have money and men and the backing of civilized society, but they had something he couldn't buy or intimidate: the desperate courage of people who'd finally found something worth fighting for. The broken compass lay on the table between them, its bent needle still pointing north toward an uncertain future. But sometimes, Eleanor reflected as she checked her knife one last time, the most important directions couldn't be found on any compass. Sometimes you had to navigate by love and determination and the unshakable belief that freedom was worth any price you had to pay for it. Tonight, they would discover just how high that price might be. Eleanor's fingers traced the delicate gold chain of her mother's locket as she and Silas made their way through the darkness toward Morrison's camp. The small oval pendant held a miniature portrait of Catherine Whitmore, young, beautiful, and radiating the quiet strength that had sustained her through a difficult life. "For courage," Eleanor whispered, feeling the familiar weight of the locket against her throat. It had been her mother's wedding gift from Eleanor's grandmother, passed down through generations of women who'd faced their own impossible choices with whatever grace they could summon. They moved like shadows through the pine forest, using every skill Silas had taught her about silent movement and natural camouflage. Eleanor's city-soft hands, now calloused from weeks of mountain life, gripped her hunting knife with steady confidence. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Eleanor would walk into Morrison's camp and surrender, creating enough distraction for Silas to position himself advantageously. Then when Morrison revealed his true intentions, as his arrogance would inevitably compel him to do, they would have witnesses to his villainy. "You remember what we discussed?" Silas asked softly as they reached the edge of the clearing. Eleanor nodded. "Let him talk. Let him hang himself with his own words, and trust you to know when the moment is right." Through the trees, they could see Morrison's campfire casting dancing shadows on 3 bedrolls arranged around the flames. 2 men sat by the fire while Morrison stood apart, studying a map by lamplight. Even at rest, he radiated the coiled tension of a predator waiting to strike. "He looks like a man who's never doubted his own righteousness," Eleanor observed quietly. "The most dangerous kind of enemy," Silas agreed. "Self-righteous men don't hesitate when they convince themselves they're serving a higher purpose." Eleanor touched the locket one final time, drawing strength from the memory of her mother's gentle courage. Then she stepped into the firelight. "Good evening, Mr. Morrison." All 3 men leaped to their feet, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Morrison's face cycled rapidly through surprise, relief, and cold satisfaction. "Miss Eleanor Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the smooth tone of a man who'd won a difficult game. "How thoughtful of you to save us the trouble of hunting you down." Eleanor walked closer to the fire, her hands visible and empty, her posture suggesting exhaustion and defeat. "I'm tired of running, tired of being cold and hungry and afraid." "I'm sure you are, my dear. Mountain life is hardly suitable for a young lady of your refinement." Morrison's eyes swept over her simple wool dress and practical boots with obvious distaste. "Where is your captor?" "Gone. He left yesterday when he realized you were closing in." Eleanor sank onto a log near the fire, wrapping her arms around herself as if seeking warmth. "He said he wouldn't hang for kidnapping some spoiled rich girl." Morrison exchanged glances with his men. "How very wise of him. Though I'm afraid his military record suggests he's more coward than sage. You know about his past? I make it my business to know everything about people who interfere with my interests." Morrison moved closer, his shadow falling across Eleanor's face. "Silas Kane is a deserter and a criminal. The fact that he abandoned you when danger approached simply confirms his character." Eleanor forced herself to look up at him with what she hoped appeared to be gratitude and relief. "I don't know what I was thinking running away like that. I must have been out of my mind to imagine I could survive on my own." temporary madness brought on by pre-wedding nerves, Morrison said smoothly. Perfectly understandable. Many young ladies experience similar episodes. When faced with the prospect of marriage, I suppose I was frightened by the responsibility, by the idea of being a proper wife to such an important man. Morrison's chest swelled with satisfaction. Natural enough. But I'm a patient man, Eleanor. I understand that you'll need time to recover from your ordeal before we can proceed with our wedding plans. Wedding plans. Eleanor injected just the right note of confusion into her voice. But surely, after what's happened, after I've been alone in the wilderness with a man for weeks, my dear girl, Morrison interrupted, his tone patronizing, you were kidnapped by a dangerous criminal. Whatever indignities you may have suffered were hardly your fault. Society will understand that you were a victim, not a willing participant. Eleanor felt sick at how easily he dismissed her agency, how completely he was prepared to rewrite her story to suit his needs. People will talk, people always talk, but they'll talk about how fortunate you were to have a devoted fiancé who never gave up searching for you. About how I risked my own safety to rescue you from a violent man. Morrison's smile was cold as winter moonlight. The wedding will take place as soon as you've recovered your health and spirits. A happy ending to a frightening adventure. And if I refuse? Morrison's mask slipped slightly, revealing the steel beneath his cultivated charm. Refuse? My dear Eleanor, I'm afraid you're in no position to refuse anything. Your reputation depends entirely on the story we choose to tell about your absence. Jake shifted uncomfortably by the fire. Mr. Morrison, maybe we should discuss this somewhere more private. Nonsense. Miss Whitmore needs to understand her situation completely. Morrison turned back to Eleanor, his voice hardening. You see, my dear, there are only two possible versions of recent events. In the first version, you were kidnapped by a violent hermit who held you against your will until I heroically rescued you. In that version, you're a victim deserving of sympathy and a wealthy husband willing to overlook your ordeal. Eleanor waited, knowing what was coming. In the second version, Morrison continued, you ran away voluntarily to live in sin with a disgraced soldier. In that version, you're a fallen woman who chose degradation over duty. No respectable man would have you, and your father would be forced to disown you to preserve the family name. Those aren't the only possible versions, Eleanor said quietly. Morrison laughed. Oh, and what other version do you propose? Eleanor stood slowly, the firelight catching the steel in her green eyes. The version where I chose freedom over a marriage to a man who sees women as property to be bought and sold. That version, Morrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, ends with you in a pauper's grave and Silas Kane hanging from the nearest tree for kidnapping and rape. The word hung in the air like a physical blow. Eleanor felt her mother's locket warm against her skin, reminding her of generations of women who'd faced down bullies with nothing but courage and conviction. You would lie about that, she asked, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. I would tell whatever story best serves justice and social order. Morrison stepped closer, his tall frame looming over her. You belong to me, Eleanor. Your father's debts ensure that you can come to that understanding willingly, or I can help you reach it through other means. What other means? Morrison's smile turned predatory. Well, if Kane were to resist arrest for kidnapping, accidents do happen. Mountain justice tends to be swift and final. And if you were discovered in a compromised state, well, marriage to me would be your only hope of redemption. Eleanor finally understood the full scope of his plan. Morrison wasn't just planning to force her into marriage. He was prepared to manufacture evidence of assault to ensure her compliance. The truth of what had happened between her and Silas would be irrelevant. Society would believe whatever story Morrison chose to tell. You're talking about murder, she said flatly. I'm talking about justice for a criminal who violated an innocent young woman. Morrison reached out to touch her cheek, and Eleanor had to fight not to recoil. Don't worry, my dear. After we're married, this unpleasant episode will be forgotten. You'll learn to appreciate the security and respectability I can provide. And if I can't learn to appreciate it, Morrison's fingers tightened slightly against her skin, then I'll have to help you learn. I'm very good at teaching lessons to those who need guidance. The threat was clear, and Eleanor felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. This man didn't just want to control her, he was prepared to break her if she resisted. He saw her not as a person with her own will and desires, but as an object to be acquired and shaped to his preferences. I see, she said softly. I'm glad you're beginning to understand. Morrison stepped back, his confidence restored. Now shall we discuss the arrangements for your return to civilization? I've brought a proper dress for you to wear, and we'll need to prepare a suitable story about your rescue. Eleanor looked around the campsite, noting the positions of Morrison's men, the location of their weapons, the various escape routes through the forest. Everything was exactly as she and Silas had planned. Actually, she said, her voice carrying a new note of steel, I think there's something you need to understand first. Morrison raised an eyebrow. Oh? Eleanor smiled, and for the first time all evening it was completely genuine. I'm not the same frightened girl who ran away from your engagement party. The mountains have a way of teaching people who they really are. And with that, she reached for her knife. Eleanor's hand never reached her knife. The sharp crack of a rifle split the mountain air, and one of Morrison's men crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The shot came from the darkness beyond the firelight, precise and controlled, a warning rather than a killing blow. Nobody move, came Silas's voice from the forest. Next shot won't be aimed to wound. Morrison spun toward the sound, his hand moving instinctively toward his pistol. Kane! I should have known you wouldn't abandon your prize so easily. Let the lady step away from the fire, Silas called back. Then we'll talk. I don't think so. Morrison's arm snaked around Eleanor's waist, pulling her against him as his gun cleared its holster. Seems to me I hold the advantage here. Eleanor felt the cold metal of Morrison's pistol barrel against her temple, but instead of fear, she felt a strange calm settle over her. This was the moment they'd prepared for, the moment when Morrison's true nature would be impossible to deny. Careful, Kane, Morrison shouted. Your little bird might get hurt if you do anything foolish. Jake, the uninjured member of Morrison's party, had taken cover behind a fallen log. His rifle trained on the darkness where Silas remained hidden. The wounded man moaned and rolled behind the fire, clutching his shoulder but still conscious. Let her go, Morrison. Silas's voice came from a different location now. He was moving, making himself a difficult target. Your quarrel is with me. My quarrel is with both of you, Morrison snapped, his arm tightening around Eleanor's ribs. You for kidnapping my fiancé, and her for being stupid enough to throw her life away on a broken-down soldier. Eleanor felt Morrison's pulse racing where his arm pressed against her back. For all his bluster, he was afraid. Men like Morrison were dangerous when cornered, but they were also prone to mistakes. Tell him, Eleanor, Morrison hissed in her ear. Tell him you're coming back with me voluntarily. Tell him this has all been a misunderstanding. Instead, Eleanor raised her voice so it would carry clearly through the forest. Silas, he's been lying about everything. He admitted he plans to kill you and force me into marriage by claiming you assaulted me. Morrison's grip tightened painfully. Shut up, you stupid girl. He threatened to hurt me if I don't obey him. He said he's good at teaching lessons to people who need guidance. I said, shut up. Morrison pressed the gun harder against her temple, but the damage was done. Jake had heard every word, and even in the flickering firelight, Eleanor could see the unease on his face. Whatever Morrison had told his men about this mission, it clearly hadn't included plans for murder and forced marriage. Mr. Morrison, Jake called uncertainly, maybe you should keep your mouth shut and do what I'm paying you for. Morrison snarled. Another rifle shot cracked through the night and Jake's hat flew off his head. The message was clear. Silas could have killed him just as easily as he'd creased his scalp. Jesus, Jake muttered, ducking lower behind his log. He could pick us off one by one from out there. Not while I have his woman, Morrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Eleanor felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Morrison was growing more desperate, more dangerous. Soon he might decide that a dead hostage was better than no hostage at all. Bartholomew," she said softly, using his first name deliberately. "You don't have to do this. You could let me go right away, tell people you never found us, let you go." Morrison's laugh was harsh with disbelief. "After everything I've invested in this arrangement? After the money I've spent, the plans I've made?" "What money? What plans?" "Your father owes me over $50,000, Morrison hissed. "Borrowed against his railroad contracts, used my credit to secure government subsidies. When the Indian troubles disrupted his construction schedule, he couldn't make his payments." Eleanor felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "So you offered to forgive the debt in exchange for my hand. More than that, I offered to make him a partner in my mining operations, give him a chance to rebuild his fortune. All he had to do was deliver one spoiled daughter to the altar, and if he couldn't deliver me..." Morrison's grip shifted, and Eleanor felt the gun barrel move away from her temple for just a moment. Then he loses everything. The railroad, the ranch, his position in society. He becomes just another broken man who gambled everything and lost. "You're talking about destroying my family. I'm talking about collecting what's owed to me. Your father made his choice when he signed those contracts. You're just the currency he's paying his debts with." Eleanor's mother's locket seemed to burn against her skin. Catherine Whitmore had been sold into marriage to pay her own father's debts, trapped in a life she'd never chosen but made the best of through quiet strength and stubborn grace. Now Morrison expected Eleanor to follow the same path, to sacrifice her freedom for her family's financial security. But Eleanor wasn't her mother. She'd learned to fight for what she wanted, learned to value her own choices over other people's expectations. "No," she said clearly. "No what?" "No, I won't be used as currency. No, I won't marry you to pay my father's debts. And no, I won't let you hurt the man I love." Morrison's arm tightened around her waist. "You don't have a choice in the matter. Everyone has a choice," Eleanor said, and in one smooth motion, she drove her elbow back into Morrison's ribs while grabbing his gun hand and forcing it skyward. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the night sky as Morrison doubled over, gasping. Eleanor twisted away from him, but his free hand caught her wrist, yanking her back toward him with enough force to send them both tumbling to the ground. They rolled in the dirt beside the fire, Morrison trying to regain control of his weapon, while Eleanor fought with the desperate strength of someone who had everything to lose. His superior size and weight gave him the advantage, but Eleanor had learned to fight dirty in the months since leaving her father's house. She raked her fingernails across his face, drew blood with her teeth when he tried to cover her mouth, and drove her knee toward his groin with all the force she could muster. Morrison cursed and struck her across the face with his free hand, splitting her lip and sending stars across her vision. "Enough," he snarled, finally managing to pin her beneath him, the gun once again pressed against her throat. "You want to play games? Fine, we'll play games." But as he spoke, Eleanor heard the soft whistle of an arrow cutting through air. Morrison's eyes went wide with shock and pain as the shaft sprouted from his shoulder, spinning him away from Eleanor and sending his pistol skittering across the dirt. Silas emerged from the darkness like an avenging spirit, a bow in his hands and murder in his eyes. "Get away from her!" Morrison clutched at the arrow in his shoulder, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You shot me. You actually shot me!" "That was a warning," Silas said, knocking another arrow. "The next one goes through your heart." Jake, still crouched behind his log, called out uncertainly, "Mr. Morrison, I think maybe we should—" His words were cut off by the sound of approaching horses. Lots of horses coming up the trail fast. Eleanor felt her heart sink, assuming Morrison had brought more men than they'd realized, but the voice that rang out across the clearing brought a surge of hope instead of despair. "This is Sheriff Davidson. Everyone drop your weapons and step into the light." Eleanor scrambled to her feet, wiping blood from her split lip. Sheriff Davidson was an honest man, one of the few lawmen in the territory who couldn't be bought or intimidated. If he was here, it meant someone had finally told the truth about what was happening. 6 mounted men rode into the firelight, led by Davidson himself, a grizzled veteran with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Behind him rode Charles Whitmore, looking older and more haggard than Eleanor had ever seen him. "Father?" Eleanor called out, confused. Charles swung down from his horse and hurried toward her, his face a mixture of relief and anguish. "Eleanor, thank God you're alive. When Martha told me what really happened—" "Martha!" Eleanor looked between her father and the sheriff. "But Morrison said she'd betrayed us. Morrison threatened my grandchildren," came a familiar voice from behind the sheriff's men. Martha herself rode into the clearing, her weathered face set with determination. "Said he'd hurt them if I didn't tell him where you'd gone." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "So you did tell him. I told him you'd gone to stay with your aunt in Boston," Martha said firmly. "Sent him chasing trains and telegraph lines while I came to find your father and tell him the truth about what kind of man his daughter was supposed to marry." "Sheriff." Davidson surveyed the scene. Morrison clutching an arrow in his shoulder, his wounded man groaning by the fire, Jake still crouched with his rifle, and Silas standing protective guard over Eleanor. "Bartholomew Morrison," Davidson said formally. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. This is ridiculous." Morrison struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. "I'm the victim here. These people attacked me." "After you held a gun to my daughter's head," Charles said quietly. "After you admitted to planning her murder if she wouldn't cooperate with your schemes." Eleanor stared at her father in shock. "You heard all that?" "We've been listening from the tree line for the past 10 minutes, Davidson explained. "Your friend Kane here has quite a set of lungs when he needs them." Made sure his voice carried far enough for witnesses. Eleanor looked at Silas, understanding flooding through her. The shots, the shouted threats, the dramatic confrontation, all of it had been designed to draw out Morrison's true intentions. In front of witnesses who could testify to his guilt, Morrison's face went white as he realized the trap he'd walked into. "You can't prove anything. It's my word against mine," Charles interrupted. "And Sheriff Davidson's, and 5 other men who heard you threaten my daughter's life. Not to mention," Davidson added, "the written confession we obtained from Martha Henderson about your threats against her family. Turns out threatening innocent children to extort information is also against the law." Morrison looked around the clearing like a trapped animal, seeing his schemes crumbling around him. Your men are going to testify against you in exchange for lighter sentences," Davidson said bluntly. "Jake's already agreed to tell us everything about your plans to force Miss Whitmore into marriage through blackmail and intimidation." Eleanor felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. It was over. Morrison's lies had been exposed, his threats neutralized, his power broken. But as she moved toward Silas, Morrison made one last desperate play. With his good arm, he lunged for his fallen pistol. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the little church in Millfield, Colorado, watching the afternoon sunlight stream through simple glass windows onto rough wooden pews. The building was nothing like the grand cathedral where her father had originally planned for her to marry Bartholomew Morrison. This church was smaller, humbler, and infinitely more honest, much like the life she'd chosen for herself. Her wedding dress was simple white cotton, sewn by her own hands with skills Martha had taught her during the long winter months. No imported silk or Belgian lace, no train that required 3 attendants to manage. Just clean lines, practical buttons, and embroidered wildflowers around the neckline, mountain asters and Indian paintbrush, columbines and larkspur, all the beautiful things that grew wild and free in the high country. At her throat, her mother's locket caught the light. Inside the delicate gold oval, she'd placed a tiny pressed flower, the first mountain aster she'd collected in Silas's journal, a reminder of the moment she'd begun to understand what freedom really meant. "Ready?" asked Martha, who'd insisted on serving as Eleanor's attendant despite her own advancing years. Eleanor touched the pair of simple gold wedding bands tucked into her bouquet, rings that Bill Morrison, the local blacksmith, had crafted himself as a wedding gift, not because he'd been paid to, but because he'd wanted to contribute something beautiful to a love story that had given the whole territory something to believe in. "More than ready," Eleanor replied, and meant it. The small congregation that had gathered included faces she'd come to know and treasure over the past months. Doc Peterson, who'd treated Morrison's arrow wound before the man was transported to Denver to stand trial. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, whose kind eyes had always held sympathy for young women trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Jake Morrison, no relation to Bartholomew despite the shared surname, who testified against his former employer and now worked as a ranch hand for Eleanor's father. And there, at the front of the church, stood Silas. Eleanor's breath caught as she saw him waiting for her. He'd trimmed his beard and hair for the occasion, and wore a simple black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and made his dark eyes seem even deeper. But it was the expression on his face that made her heart race, a look of wonder and gratitude, as if he couldn't quite believe that this beautiful moment was real. Beside him stood Charles Whitmore, who'd asked for the honor of officiating the ceremony. Eleanor's father had spent the winter months rebuilding both his railroad business and his relationship with his daughter. The financial scandal surrounding Morrison's arrest had actually helped Charles in the long run. When the truth came out about the extortionist schemes, several other businessmen had come forward with similar stories, and public sympathy had swung strongly in favor of Morrison's victims. More importantly, Charles had finally begun to understand that his daughter's happiness might be worth more than any business arrangement he could make. As Eleanor walked down the aisle, she thought about Morrison's trial, which had dominated newspaper headlines across Colorado for weeks. The man who'd seemed so powerful and untouchable had proven surprisingly fragile when stripped of his wealth and social position. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, extortion, conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, and threats of violence, he'd ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a 20-year prison sentence. More satisfying than his punishment, though, was what had happened to his victims. The other businessmen he'd extorted had banded together, forming a cooperative that now controlled much of the territory's mining and railroad interests. Charles Whitmore had emerged as one of the leaders of this group, his reputation enhanced rather than damaged by his willingness to put his daughter's welfare above his own financial interests. As Eleanor reached the front of the church, Silas stepped forward to take her hand. His calloused fingers intertwined with hers, and she felt the same sense of rightness that had sustained her through all the difficult months of building their new life together. "Dearly beloved," Charles began, his voice carrying clearly through the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other the courage to choose love over fear, hope over despair, and freedom over convenience." Eleanor smiled, recognizing her father's attempt to craft words that honored what she and Silas had been through together. During the long winter months at the cabin, Charles had visited regularly, slowly coming to understand that his daughter's happiness lay not in society, ballrooms, but in the simple rhythms of mountain life. He'd watched Eleanor teach reading to the children of local miners and ranch hands, using skills he'd never thought to value. He'd seen Silas's patient craftsmanship as he carved toys for those same children, beautiful things made with love rather than for profit. And he'd witnessed the quiet contentment that radiated from both of them when they worked together, building a life based on mutual respect and shared dreams. "Silas," Charles continued, "do you take Eleanor to be your wife, to love and cherish, to support her dreams and respect her choices, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Silas said, his voice steady and sure. "With all my heart." "Eleanor, do you take Silas to be your husband, to love and cherish, to support his dreams and respect his choices, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Eleanor looked into Silas's eyes and saw reflected there all the things that had brought them to this moment. Courage in the face of danger, healing from old wounds, the patient building of trust and intimacy. But most of all, she saw love, pure, honest, and freely chosen. "I do," she said, her voice ringing with certainty. They exchanged the simple gold bands, each ring a perfect circle representing the wholeness they'd found in each other. As Silas slipped the wedding band onto Eleanor's finger, she remembered the first time she'd seen his hands, scarred and strong, capable of both violence and incredible tenderness. Now those same hands would be her partner in building a future neither of them could have imagined alone. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Silas, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle and full of promise, witnessed by friends who'd watched their love story unfold against the backdrop of the Colorado mountains. When they broke apart, Eleanor saw tears in Martha's eyes and smiles on faces throughout the small congregation. But it was the expression on her father's face that moved her most, a mixture of pride, relief, and genuine happiness for the daughter who'd finally found her place in the world. The reception was held in the church's small social hall, with food contributed by every family in the valley. Eleanor had never tasted anything more delicious than the simple feast prepared with love by people who'd come to see her and Silas's family rather than strangers. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, Eleanor and Silas slipped away to sit on the church's front steps, watching the sun set behind the familiar peaks that had become their home. "Any regrets?" Silas asked softly, his arm around her shoulders. Eleanor considered the question seriously. A year ago, she'd been the pampered daughter of a wealthy railroad baron, expected to marry for advantage and live a life of comfortable conformity. Now she was the wife of a mountain man, facing a future that would likely include hard work, uncertain income, and challenges she couldn't yet imagine. "Not one," she said firmly. "You." Silas was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor knew he was thinking about Sarah and Emma, the family he'd lost so many years ago. The guilt and grief would always be part of him, but they no longer defined him. Love had a way of making room for the past while still building toward the future. "I used to think," he said finally, "that I'd used up my share of happiness in this life. That what happened to my first family was punishment for the things I'd done in the war. And I didn't deserve a second chance." Eleanor nestled closer to his warmth, understanding the weight of what he was sharing. "But loving you has taught me something important," Silas continued. "Happiness isn't something you earn or deserve. It's something you choose to accept when it's offered, and something you choose to build when you find the right person to build it with." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the simple wisdom of his words. "And have you chosen to accept it?" Silas turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of the mountain sunset. "Every day for the rest of my life, as if summoned by their happiness, a shooting star traced across the darkening sky, a bright line of hope against the vast darkness." Eleanor made a wish, though she knew she already had everything she'd ever really wanted. Later, as they rode back toward their cabin in the mountains, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with her desperate flight from an unwanted marriage, continued through weeks of learning to survive in the wilderness, and culminated in a love story that had captured the imagination of everyone who'd witnessed it. But more than that, it was a story about the courage to choose your own path, even when that path led through danger and uncertainty. It was about learning that freedom wasn't just the absence of constraints, but the presence of choice. And it was about discovering that love, when freely given and received, could heal even the deepest wounds. The cabin that awaited them was the same structure where Eleanor had first learned to tend a fire, and Silas had first dared to hope again. But now it was truly their home, filled with shared memories and dreams for the future. The root cellar had been expanded, the roof strengthened for mountain winters, and a new room added for the children they both hoped would come in time. On the mantelpiece sat Silas's repaired compass, its needle once again pointing true north. Beside it rested Eleanor's collection of pressed flowers, now bound in a proper book with pages and pages of mountain memories. And on the walls hung examples of their shared craft, carved flowers and forest creatures, each piece a testament to the beauty that could grow from patient hands and loving hearts. As they settled into their marriage bed for the first time, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion, not because she was now someone's wife, but because she had finally, fully become herself. The frightened girl who'd fled her father's house had transformed into a woman who knew her own mind and trusted her own strength. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, the words carrying all the weight of everything they'd been through together. "And I love you," Silas whispered back. "Today, tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that." Outside their window, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, holding their small human happiness in the palm of an ancient hand. And somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate, a sound that no longer spoke of loneliness but of the wild, free love that could bloom in the most unexpected places when two souls were brave enough to reach for it. The rich heiress had indeed vanished, just as the newspapers had proclaimed. But in her place had emerged something infinitely more valuable, a woman who'd learned that the greatest treasure was the freedom to choose love over duty, hope over fear, and the courage to build a life worth living on her own terms.